Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 43, entitled Elitism, Eugenics, Hierarchy, and Inequality. In a world collapsing at nearly free-fall speed, very possibly on the brink of a Third World War, an American Civil War, and a multitude of related conflicts, I thought we'd take a step back from all of that for a bit and make this cast about an almost completely unrelated set of topics, as a respite from this constant barrage of negative news. And I wanted to discuss these particular topics in large part because they're controversial and contentious, and because I think the foremost responsibility of anyone in a position like mine, with a modest platform and a desire to discuss ideas and hopefully be a net positive force while doing so, is to not take the easy path and hammer away on all of those topics that those of you listening are almost universally agreed upon, or those I think most people have a relatively firm handle on or a deeper understanding of, but instead to speak to those topics on which many good people might, currently, be on opposite sides of the fence, at least to a degree, and especially those topics on which I think some might disagree with my own views, at least at the outset of this cast. But perhaps, and hopefully, won't feel such disagreement at the conclusion of the cast. I'd like to start with an admission that might surprise some people, and say that I don't really have a problem with some form of elitism, dependent on how one defines this term. And there's a lot to unpack here, so let's just get right to it. Firstly, the all-important point needs to be made that those who today call themselves elites are a very different breed than those that might have been considered societal or cultural elites across most other historical eras. The unprecedented ascendancy of a merchant class has changed this dynamic radically, especially in the age of technologically driven mass media. Previous generations of children might have grown up idolizing a great hero, or a strong and principled and capable leader, or a courageous warrior. Today's generation is just as likely to look to a Bezos or Gates, or some lesser pop culture celebrity that succeeded at the same ultimately hollow game of economic gain, and seek to follow in their footsteps. The stories of these wealthy men may not make women swoon or inspire childhood fantasies, at least not to the same extent. But in the absence of better stories, or legends, or myths, the ideas may still be strong enough to help orient a child's path through early life, creating perspectives and ideas and habits that last into adulthood. And I think this is a tragedy. It's causing us to churn out mere copies of men for whom seeking personal material gain is their primary motive force, threatening to create an entire generation of such types, and further propagate this culture and this cycle. So there's no denying that times have changed, and that the, quote, elite, or ruling class on the whole, is now populated by a very different sort of man, with sufficient wealth enough to subtly and indirectly affect how they're covered and spoken about throughout media, popular culture, entertainment, etc. And not only how they're covered as individuals, but how their ideas, preferences, and life philosophies are spoken about. Their wealth is, in many ways, reshaping how most people think. In a sense, it's reshaping our culture. This is the effect of the elite class on the broader world. And I do think this marks a significant step backward. And I tend to think the qualities most purely expressed by this newly ascendant merchant class, broadly speaking, aren't in any way equal to the great leaders and artists and geniuses of other eras. To such an extent, in fact, that it might be argued that there's been an inversion of our social hierarchy. So when I speak of being comfortable with the idea of some elitism, and the notions of giving greater respect and power and influence to an elite class, this is predicated on the fact that a fairly healthy and natural culture, free from the largely artificial manipulations of money, exists, and that these elites in this hypothetical were elites due to exceptional merit, or courage, or character, or fruitful accomplishments and achievements, arising organically from these more natural conditions, an elite class could play the most highly positive role. It's so easy to fall into the trap of, as the saying goes, throwing out the baby with the bathwater and rejecting the concepts of elites and societal stratification, because when we look around at our present elites, they're such incredibly poor representatives of this term. But I think this is a serious mistake. If a man kills the true king and wears his crown and holds his scepter while being both evil and incompetent, this isn't a reason to despise kingship itself. It's a reason to despise subversives and hijackers. I'd also like to speak against the very modern and very Marxist conception of the elite class, by definition being cruel or parasitic or exploitative. This is a worldview crafted by psychologically sick and disoriented men by way of projection. Though they may never outright admit this, and perhaps in many cases don't even recognize it in themselves, what they're actually communicating to the world by holding this viewpoint is that if they should ever become part of this elite class, they themselves would likely have the urge to oppress and mistreat and abuse those beneath them. In other words, this perspective acts as a collective expression of their subconscious and their secret desires. But no. The truth is that there are a great many instances throughout history of the elites of a given nation or people being hailed as elites in large part due to their strength of virtue, their magnanimous nature, their admirable character, and their clear desire to be a force for good. Chivalric knights are a good example here. Germanic chieftains are another. This idea that all societies were some Darwinistic struggle in which every individual selfishly scrambles to get to the top in order to more freely mistreat his fellow man is an insidious myth. In many cases, the elite class was celebrated by the public at large, even seen as a mark of pride or a badge of honor, much like a person today might celebrate the successes of a close family member, and for similar reasons. In celebrating this exceptional man, they were often celebrating themselves and everything they believed in and held dear, in a sense. The nature and caliber of this elite class sitting atop the hierarchy has never been a small or inconsequential matter. When these elites were true elites, it helped positively orient the culture, powerfully so. Not just by their influence on others and the fact that others, especially children, would seek to emulate them, but because the younger generation then had a very clear conception of the specific positive traits and attributes they'd need to cultivate and maximize to someday rise to that class themselves, with a bit of luck and a great deal of discipline and hard work. This would push them to become more competent warriors, or leaders, or simply more noble and well-adjusted men, increasingly kind or well-mannered and civil, increasingly disciplined and motivated. In fact, I think it'd be fair to say that a society and culture is most robust and healthy when its best men have the most power and influence. And if one accepts this premise, they might equally accept that the opposite is true. Namely, a society or culture is least healthy when its worst men have the greatest deal of power and influence. There's a certain subset of populist thinking on the right, and in many libertarian circles, propagating the point of view that no man should be considered an elite next to his fellow man. And this manner of living, if fully embraced, would certainly be vastly better than what we're enduring at present, as it helped eliminate the powerful effects of corrupt and net negative elites. Men who aren't good examples of how to think or speak or live. But that's not saying much, because virtually anything would be superior to what we're dealing with right this moment. And though this abandonment of both hierarchy and the very conception of an elite class may well dispense with many of the negatives we're wrestling with, it also simultaneously dispenses with the potential positives, of the sort that those in the distant past so often enjoyed. It represents a possible means of dispensing with a pressing problem, only to create additional problems in its place. Again, it's so easy to be disgusted with the idea of an elite class, or an expert class, or circles of powerful men having an outsized influence on how we live and how our nations are structured. But this is precisely why it's so important to keep in mind that it's not the concept of hierarchy itself that's to blame here, but rather that we've allowed our hierarchies to be inverted. It's not the idea of expertise or an expert or specialist class, but the way in which money has turned our expert class into a joke. It's not academia or the concept of higher education we take issue with, but rather the way in which modern academia has been so corrupted by pretentious partisan hacks, and the way that higher education is now equivalent to ideological indoctrination. With the advent of fiat currencies and central banking, all wealth gradually began to flow into the hands of a certain culture of men. And with the passage of time and clever strategic maneuvering, the effects of this wealth began to seep into and come to dominate nearly every other sphere. But we shouldn't believe this to simply be the natural state of things, or the way things have to be indefinitely. Across the broad stretch of history, the time period in which a handful of banking families have been so profoundly dominant represents only a small slice, an exception to the rule. If we might find a path to throw off this sickly system, and revamp our social and cultural and economic structures to allow more natural promotion dynamics to prevail, and thus allow the ideal man to again flourish, virtually everything will change for the better as a result. And speaking of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, let's move to what might be the most controversial of the topics in this cast, and speak about eugenics. This is another instance in which I think a misapprehension is causing many people to reflexively reject the entire concept in a reactionary way and with little serious thought. The reason, I believe, is simple. When the average person thinks of eugenics, they think of manipulation or deceit or forcibly compelled sterilization or something similar along these lines. In other words, they think of corrupt individuals or governments or institutions using nefarious and underhanded means to accomplish eugenic goals. But there's absolutely no reason eugenic aims would need to be pursued this way. For example, picture a nation, a true nation of the sort we formerly had and might someday have again, namely a united and cohesive group of people with similar ethnic and cultural roots and with at least broadly similar ideological goals or aims. Now, picture them starting a fund into which anyone might contribute that would financially incentivize the voluntary sterilization of those individuals with the most painful and debilitating hereditary diseases. Again, the emphasis here is on voluntary. If an individual learned that he had an extremely high likelihood of passing on a brutally painful or debilitating condition to his children, who would in turn pass it on to theirs, and so on, he may choose, in this hypothetical future, to make the decision not to do so, in exchange for significant financial compensation. Or he may still choose to have children. The choice is entirely his. But if this choice were available across a stretch of time and several generations, the amount of pain and suffering experienced by the population at large would be profoundly minimized. No abortion necessary, no forced sterilization, no murder or imprisonment, not even social stigma, ideally. Simply a choice one could make, or not make, according to their own preferences, existing quietly in the background. Similarly, this same culture could decide they wanted to slightly magnify what they considered to be positive traits, whether this be intelligence, or overall physical health, or anything in between. They might collectively agree on a simple assortment of tests or measures to definitively and objectively quantify these things as best as they're able. And no method would be perfect, of course, but absolute perfection isn't needed here. And then use a similar fund to heavily incentivize births. Let's say an individual has a genetic quirk making his immune system exceptionally powerful, and the culture at large had decided this type of thing was a clear net positive and wanted to see more of it in future generations. This fund might pay out a certain flat sum for every child he's able to have. Again, no force, no compulsion, no shame, just voluntary choices. It might even be argued that such a structure would be more natural in the sense that throughout most of history it really was the best and brightest, or most capable and healthy, that tended to be in a position to have more children. It's only in the most recent period of time that we've almost completely flipped this on its head and have created a situation worldwide in which those peoples least able to develop the means of subsistence, least able to feed and clothe and house themselves, are having by far the most children and the largest families. Even in the cases in which these children are likely to starve to death, they still continue to have them in most of these cases. The immense pain and suffering that results from this approach can't possibly be anyone's ideal. But it's more than just not the ideal. The term existential threat gets thrown around far too liberally in our age, but this is a realm in which it absolutely applies. If present birth rates were to continue as is across the globe, and especially if on top of this was superimposed a globalist empire of the sort already beginning to take shape, the entire world would suffer for it, and quickly began to degenerate into the type of third world conditions we're increasingly seeing on our city streets. There's really no debate about this. The nature versus nurture debate still rages and is a fascinating one, but no serious and non-politically motivated person can argue against the simple reality that our genetic code plays an enormously important and inescapable role in determining who we are. The Minnesota adoption studies done many years back are a great example here. Siblings who were separated at birth and adopted into different homes were tracked down later on in life, and it was discovered that even those adopted into polar opposite environments from one another, for example, with one child adopted into wealth and opportunity and the ability to attend, quote, better schools, and the other child adopted into a struggling family with far fewer opportunities and a technically inferior education, both proved to have similar IQs later in life, hinting at the fact that IQ may be more inheritable, more nature than nurture. Equally fascinating was the number of other unexpected parallels between these many sets of siblings. They tended to have similar interests, read similar books, even drove similar cars in many cases. And these are just a few examples of a great many. No child is completely locked into being a duplicate of their parents, to be sure, but it's an undeniable fact that more intelligent parents tend to have more intelligent children, and physically healthy parents tend to have more physically healthy children. In itself, nothing should bother us about this simple truth. The bother comes with our learned association of this idea with some tyrannical or underhanded approach to kill or forcibly sterilize the unfit, along with the more justified question of who gets to determine the fitness criteria. So again, I understand the instinctive negative reaction of many good people to the word or concept of eugenics. And indeed, an argument could be made against some of those who seem to be leading players in this sphere in the past. But this shouldn't cause us to take the opposite extreme. As with virtually everything in life, it seems that an artful balance is best here. No forcible compulsion, and just as importantly, no plans hatched in secret and out of public view, or pursued without full transparency. But at the same time, I'm completely against any point of view that would seek to chide or reprimand, or in any way stand opposed to a public-supported structure allowing for voluntary eugenic measures to take shape. If we're wholly uncaring or uninterested in the ongoing development of the human species, I think this represents a failure in our role as thoughtful stewards of God's creation. And as direct result of this willful ignorance or inaction, we really do risk eventually creating our own hell on earth. We'll see spikes in debilitating physical and psychological maladies exponentially increase. Poverty and criminality will become ever more rampant. Our living spaces and quality of life in general will quickly degrade in every measurable way. And all because we chose to pretend our irresponsibility or inattention in this sphere was somehow positive or virtuous. all because of an overly simplistic notion that because some bad people pursued these goals in devious ways in the past, that the goals themselves can't be pursued in any other way. And this is ridiculous. It's not at all out of the realm of possibility that a population might come together and decide to make some proactive choices on these fronts, especially with regard to using simple economic incentives or anything similarly attractive and compelling. And to move on to the subject of equality, human beings are absolutely not equal in any respect. If it were so, we'd not be able to differentiate one another. We'd not hold any competitions because they'd be meaningless. Somewhere along the way of cultural and psychological development, and perhaps not by accident, but by nefarious design, some started to conflate the concept of every human being having intrinsic worth, just as all life has value in the eyes of God, with the idea that all human beings ultimately have equal capabilities, or equal real-world utility or competence. It'd be difficult to think of an idea less supported by reality, or less backed up by history. There are vast chasms separating any one human being from any other, when it comes to things like physical health, or strength, or hand-eye coordination, or intelligence, or personality, and character, or temperament. And we can't simply act as if this is some unimportant thing, not worthy of much thought or consideration. We are different from the animal kingdom in a multitude of ways, as we've been blessed with consciousness and the ability to think and experience reality in much more complex and profound ways. But of course, we're not completely different across the board, because all things in nature follow the same broad-level rulebook of sorts. Studies done on chimpanzees and apes, along with a handful of other intelligent species, seem to consistently show that their societies fall into disorder when the hierarchy falls into disorder. In other words, when those that possess the optimal set of skill sets are, for one reason or another, unable to rise to the top, or when some fluke event allows a less capable creature to successfully take charge. Human history seems to show this exact same principle at play, so very clearly, time and time and time again. Crucially, it becomes all-important here how we define the ideal. Everything hinges upon how clearly and how well we're able to accurately define competence or aptitude, and how we fashion our judgment criteria, determining who is most capable and who is least capable. And to quickly illustrate what I think is an important point, I'll go ahead and make a controversial statement of the devil's advocate sort. I believe that in some sense, and from a certain perspective, the Nietzschean or Darwinian idea that might makes right could be perceived as valid, even a healthy ordering and orienting mechanism of human societies. But the emphasis here is from a certain perspective, because it all boils down to how we define might. The earliest Christians may have considered Jesus to be the best example of their own personal definition of might. Not a physical dominance, not a desire to cow others into submission by force or subtle threats, but a much more lofty and expansive view of the word. Consider Seneca's quote about all cruelty springing from weakness. Consider that most truly strong men, aware of and in touch with a healthy masculinity, don't tend to be insecure, and tend to be more immune to that multitude of missteps caused by ego, envy, pettiness, selfish pride. If we defined a mighty person as someone that possessed this healthiest sort of strength, someone who was noble and magnanimous, virtuous and ethical, someone that could absolutely dominate his opposition if and when he ever chose to, but whose default state was to be loving and kind and generous wherever it was possible and justified to be so. In other words, if we worked hard to have the most impressive and inspired definition of might, we'd end up with an extremely admirable definition, capable of creating deeply healthy and robust hierarchies. And in this sense, might would and should make right. Those with the greatest amount of this specifically defined type of might should indeed be the more powerful and influential figures, and the ideal toward which all others quested and strove. And it's fair to say that I'm stretching the definition and the general understanding of that infamous might makes right cliché for the purpose of discussion and to make an important point, and that as it's generally and widely understood, I don't agree with its presumptions, because the vast majority of those who use the term have in mind a very different conception of might, usually a product of a reductionist and materialist perspective, devoid of a god or a creative force as its orienting center, propagated by those who seem to view mankind as precisely equivalent to an animal and view might simply as the ability to impose oneself on others. This is a terrible prescription for the creation of any hierarchical structure. One of the worst, in fact, especially in an increasingly sick and disoriented culture. Look around you as we speak, and think of the men who've been most capable of imposing themselves. Think of the manipulative and deceitful and underhanded methods they use, how they tend to band together in secret societies, how they freely engage in conspiracies, have little to no ethical or moral scruples as they do so. The idea that just because a certain type of man can climb to the top of the heap at any given point in history is proof that he somehow represents the apex development of his species is complete nonsense, of course. If we wanted to present an alien species with a single human being, best representative of the most net positive traits of the entire species, we'd probably not push forward a Rothschild, if we're being honest. To give credit where due, such men are brilliant in the narrow task of attaining power and money, but no sane person would attempt to argue that this specific type of brilliance is equivalent to the genius that truly pushes humanity forward and upward. Interestingly, in completely healthy or natural environments, I always like to think back to Tacitus's description of the simple living Germanic peoples as he found them, as an example here. The might makes right conception was far more valid and applicable, because they not only chose to define might in a manner more similar to the positive definition I gave a moment ago, but the way their culture and society was oriented, the virtuous and strong were extremely likely to rise to the top. Character and temperament mattered significantly, as did courage and bravery, intelligence, physical strength, even aesthetic beauty, but even a person's family history. All of these were considered when it came to things like mate selection or selecting a ruling chieftain, and organically so. In the case of ruling kings or chieftains, for example, men would just naturally rally to the banner of those men they innately most respected, and those they felt would be successful in their endeavors. Attaching themselves to that wagon was both a mark of respect, but also in their self-interest. By becoming a warrior for a capable leader, and especially for the most capable leader of their era, they'd yield great dividends in the long run, as this chieftain made gains in power and influence and territory and wealth, and earned additional fame and renown by giving generously, which was the hallmark trait of such men. Now, it's fair to say that society has changed, and certain specific traits or skill sets are in less demand, and others in more demand, than they were many hundreds or thousands of years ago. But I'd suggest that these changes are much more minor than most might assume at first glance. In other words, men immensely capable with sword and shield might be in less demand in our age. This is certainly fair to say. But the broader and underlying traits that made these men of the past so skilled in their spheres are timelessly valuable. For example, the self-discipline necessary to train and perfect their skills, the confidence, the will and drive to succeed, even the robust health and physical strength. So while it's fair to say that our society and culture have changed, I'd contend that the vast majority of the net positive traits and tendencies and attributes are in actuality the same now as they've always been. What we most benefit from is a conscious recognition of exactly what these root net positive traits are, and a willingness to once again create an ideal to strive toward accordingly. Part of what makes people so uncomfortable with the idea of inequality is in my opinion, another surface-level misapprehension resulting from a lack of consideration of the topic, or due to superficially accepting the perspectives of a very sick modern world. This specific misapprehension is, again, of a Marxist sort, namely that where inequality exists, brutal and cruel oppression must also exist. This is a lie. It's so poisonously false, and such a misread, and so nefarious. Because when you can cause people to think in this manner, they also begin to act in this manner. The same people who bemoan inequality and demand equality because they feel they're being oppressed by those in superior positions are the most likely to become that very oppressor when the roles are reversed, and they're in this superior position. When one embraces this framework of thinking, when they pretend all of human nature is this base and shallow and ignoble and petty, they can't help but be part of this framework because it represents their perceived spectrum of all of human behavior. And they're a human being, after all, so they must fall somewhere within these bounds, somewhere between oppressor and oppressed. Any student of history will know how sickly and false this conception is. There have been many instances in which inequality didn't lead to something resembling oppression at all. Many instances in which those in lesser positions celebrated those in higher positions, and vice versa. The farmer, recognizing he wouldn't have his land to be able to feed his family and others without the help of the knight, who recognizes, in turn, he wouldn't be able to devote his life to martial pursuits were it not for the tireless work of the farmer, and who both recognize, in turn, that while they get to narrowly focus their time and energy to accomplish relatively straightforward goals, the king, meanwhile, has the weight of the world on his shoulders. Inequality of both ability and one's position or occupation in life is simply a natural and inescapable reality, and not only shouldn't be done away with, but can't be done away with. The individual who represents the best in his given sphere should be allowed the most freedom or power or influence in that given sphere, and in most cases should be held up as the ideal accordingly. This gives all others within that sphere a clear understanding of how to progress, in the truest sense of that word, how to improve, refine, to climb the ladder. These exceptional bests do deserve more power, more influence, or more compensation. It's easy to look at our broken structure, so wholly and completely fixated now on economic gain, or look at cases in which a CEO, for example, who does little to nothing at the top of a corporate structure, earning as much as several hundred of his most competent and hardworking employees, and recoil. But this only indicates that our specific structure is broken, not that the conception of natural hierarchy itself is somehow broken, or unworthy of implementation. Our current hierarchy is so broken and malformed precisely because it isn't natural anymore. These tend to be difficult things to grasp, and it's one of the reasons I so often encourage the broadest level thinking and doing everything we can to make sure we take in the entire forest along with the trees. It's difficult to see the possibilities of other frameworks or structures when we're so deeply immersed and lost in one very specific framework or structure. Lost to the extent that we're in danger of coming to believe that it's the only possible one. And the moment we take our current framework as the only possible framework, for example, our hyper-economic focus of the modern age, we're then in danger of everywhere tossing out the baby with the bathwater, of tossing out timeless, root-level concepts that have served us well for so long, only because specific implementations of them have broken down due to our nations and cultures being so deeply subverted, and our hierarchies being turned upside down, and everything being thrown into chaos and disarray. To live in an optimally healthy and well-functioning society, the natural inequality of individuals must be discerned accurately to best craft a proper hierarchy. An elite class of individuals should be welcomed when this happens, for a multitude of reasons. When the actual best and brightest are able to work side by side with one another in healthy conditions, incredible things can result. Incredible things do result, things that benefit everyone, not just this class of elites. It's simply paramount that we learn to define our terms properly again, to define what should qualify a person as worthy of becoming an elite, to define might or strength, competence or intelligence, etc. We simply need to learn to judge and discern accurately again, according to more timeless and fundamentally sound criteria. The keen-eyed will have noticed already our modern age's obsession with demanding that we not judge or discriminate, that we not dare engage our powers of discernment. Think, for a moment, of just how deeply strange, how unhealthy and unnatural this is. Of course, this push has been decked out with pleasant-sounding words and ideas, and the claim is that judging or discriminating is racist, or sexist, or ableist, or any multitude of other nonsense terms. But of course, it isn't any of these. It can be, in specific instances, depending on how one chooses to engage in the act. But in itself, learning to judge and discriminate isn't the least bit net negative. And of course, broadly speaking, it's very much the opposite. Maximizing the good and eliminating the bad entirely hinges on our ability to recognize both. When certain forces attempt to blur these lines, we should be deeply suspicious of their motives for doing so. In my opinion, and in my experience, those working hardest to blur these lines are doing so because they know they and theirs can't rise to ultimate power within a nation that's cultivated a healthy and just and well-oriented hierarchy. And they don't care about a well-functioning society. They care about personal power. Truly, many of these types would be indifferent if their blunders or incompetence set the entire world on fire, as long as they were sitting on the throne with the power and privilege as it occurred, with power enough to dodge or evade responsibility. These are genuinely sick men. So sick, in fact, that it may well be that they're incapable of recognizing or coming to terms with their sickness, which means it pervades everything they think, everything they say and do, without their direct conscious recognition. And this is precisely why they need to be removed from power, at least power over us, and those that most strenuously reject them, as quickly and completely as is possible, before this wholesale inversion is complete and all begin to suffer from the fallout. The simple difference between what I feel should be our healthy expression of elitism and the modern and current form of elitism on display is that it should be approached and fostered and manifested in such a way that there isn't any ill will felt on either end of the spectrum, meaning either a desire from those at the top to oppress or mistreat or exploit or in any way be unjust, or an instinct toward envy and resentment, a desire to pull down and sabotage from those at the bottom. This can seem like a tall order, even a pipe dream, in our modern multicultural environments, and it may well be both of these, within these modern multicultural environments. But the moment we're able to construct a different environment, one more similar to those we've always lived in since time immemorial, it become almost second nature. When you see someone succeeding or accomplishing or doing great things, and you consider them practically family, or have reason to feel some strong tie or bond or mutual resonance, it's far easier to cheer the success. And if and when you yourself are powerful or influential in any way, and see all those over whom you might have power or influence as brothers or family, it's then, of course, far easier to fight any and all urges toward mistreatment or oppression or abuse, or corruption for that matter. This is just one of the countless arguments for the creation of more homogeneous and cohesive and unified societies and living arrangements. It makes every last aspect of life, and of governance, and the development of culture and social structures, so much easier and more natural, so much less fraught with dangers and disasters at every turn. The unifying theme of this cast is that a system where more capable or better oriented men might be cultivated, and slowly but surely rise to the top in an organic fashion, is not just a net positive, but a necessity for any people seeking to truly flourish. And that modernity shouldn't, and ultimately doesn't, represent an argument against social stratification or the idea of elites or even experts, because it's not the concept or idea itself that's broken and has failed, but rather our specific sickly manifestation of it. We no longer have true elites or true experts in most spheres. Instead, we have men willing to act the role in exchange for money and career advancement, but whose objective talents, if measured against their peers of generations ago, in so many cases would be found greatly inferior. Money has taken over the structure, and has even attempted to reshape it to ensure its influence can't so easily or cleanly be dispensed with in the future. And yet, we must find a way to dispense with this monopolistic effect of money and those who create it on our way of life. When men begin to serve money above all else, everything begins to collapse. And not merely because the meritocratic dimension suffers, for example with regard to occupational competence, but because the character of individuals playing leading roles begins to suffer. And this matters tremendously, far more than many might assume at first glance, and far more so even than the loss of genuine competence. But there is an upside. One of the intriguing aspects about standing on a precipice of national or even worldwide collapse, as we are now, is the sheer possibility on the horizon. We need to start creatively envisioning again new systems and structures, a new culture, a new unifying mythos. And I use the term new here fairly loosely. They'll be new, but almost certainly composed according to older, timeless themes, both new and old in a sense. And one of the aspects of a culture I'd most like to see take shape is the recognition, once again, of the immense importance of character and virtue and things like loyalty and honor and courage. All of those traits and tendencies that so many have been gradually indoctrinated into dismissing or devaluing, yet that in actuality lie at the very center of what makes high culture a possibility. Picture children's stories hammering home their integral importance in compelling ways, short films or music created, or books written, speaking to the best examples of this character and virtue, or the heroes that best exemplified them. I'd like to see us consciously recognize and take on the task of cultural development, of making efforts to collectively steer our ship in the ideal direction, efforts to surround ourselves with things that inspire health and happiness and vigor. And a specific element of our past I hope we might find the path to rediscover soon is the notion of a nation being analogous to a body, with each faction or individual having an archetypal role to play according to their fundamental nature and their own innate skill sets to ensure this body functions optimally. Speaking personally to help illustrate the point, on a superficial level, I might not personally have a great deal in common with, for example, the average truck driver or a rural farmer, or many different types that have specifically devoted themselves to learning how to actually do a range of fruitful things, as opposed to a devotion to an educational or philosophical path in life. But I've learned to sincerely respect the genuine and hard-working folks who take this path, even to be truly humbled by the number of things they know how to do, often like second nature and with effortless ease, that I wouldn't be able to do. Not just this, but to respect that they regularly apply this wealth of knowledge to get things done and make everything else in the world possible. I feel like one of the healthiest steps I've taken over the past many years is to make a concerted effort to find reasons to deeply respect those I consider allies or kin who happen to have taken different paths that I haven't, and who've mastered territory that I haven't. If we're not careful, it becomes a natural human tendency to glorify everything that we are, or worse yet, everything that we think we are, and subconsciously chip away at or minimize the importance of everything that we're not. This type of self-justification can stoke the ego and make us feel better about ourselves, so it's a powerful draw, but it's ultimately poisonous and completely unhelpful. None of us represent the entire puzzle. We are each a single piece. Or, to use the body analogy, we might think of ourselves as each representing different appendages and limbs and organs. The heart function complements the brain function, and vice versa. The strong arm can help protect the body, but would get nowhere, literally, without the strong legs. And both would amount to nothing without a strong core. The healthiest and most natural mode of living is within a nation that recognizes itself as a singular body, in which all elements are complementary to one another and dependent upon one another to flourish. Questing for independence is a natural state of mind, as our present nations and power centers so completely collapse and seek to exert ever more corrupt control over us as they do so. And it's a healthy thing to want to flee from all of this, and then turn this into a permanent way of life. But I strongly believe the ultimate ideal is one in which strong individuals eventually come together to form a still stronger, cohesive whole, and in full recognition of their own ideal place within that whole, coupled with a desire to play this role to the best of their ability. Not because they're forcibly compelled by laws or threats to do so, not even because of mere economic incentives constantly dangled over their heads, but because they love and resonate with the larger body they're an integral part of, and want to see it reach its fullest potential. A people can certainly develop other incentives to ensure this happens, and economic incentives might not even be such a bad thing if reoriented in a way that drives people to act in fundamentally positive ways. But I'd like to see our most important currency return to being things like honor and reputation, respect, loyalty, and courage. These things need to matter more, again, than the purely financial or material. And they would, organically so, in a healthy culture that chose to proactively orient itself in that direction. Imagine living in an environment in which all are engaging in friendly competition to outdo one another in these respects, as opposed to simply serving mammon and fiat currencies and the men who print them. Of course, it would be overly idealistic to presume we could turn an entire nation into this in short order. But it's such a mistake to believe we need to somehow convince hundreds of millions to walk this path before anything of substance happens. A great many are slumbering, and will slumber indefinitely. In every great historical turning point, the majority play little to no role, especially at the outset. What's needed is only a significant handful of committed, clear-sighted individuals with sufficient morale and a well-defined sense of purpose, and a willingness to fight and earnestly work toward what they believe in. This should be our goal. I'll have much more to say on the topic in a more concrete way in an upcoming video. Until then, that's it for now, and I hope you're all well.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my